Well, thank you very much, Ann, and you can hear me back there. It's a pleasure to be back here on familiar ground, although I've more often sat where you're sitting than speaking from here. We're talking about a subject today, and I'll be referring to MENA. And MENA quite literally means the Middle East and North Africa. So I'll be referring to this as a generic term, ranging from here all the way over to the Atlantic Ocean and Morocco, although I'll focus on certain countries more than others. And what I'd like to do is, in approaching this subject, to try and be provocative and to deal with this in terms of a broad brush approach to developments and what's likely to occur. And to look at this not only in terms of what is going on right now, but what might happen in a decade or even several decades. One of the problems is that when we analyze these things today, and I'm an historian, I look at these things in terms of past events elsewhere, and in a comparative perspective, this quite often is not the way that we look at things today in the media, because we have so much instant media that tells us supposedly what's going on at this very moment. Of course, this technology can be used by various countries against each other as well. But this quite often leads to a good deal of disinformation or claims that really don't lead us to any understanding of what is going on. So I'm going to discuss things with respect to what we might call the long term, and with some reference to past events in other areas of the world, not just the Middle East, North Africa. And I'd like to propose that we're entering into a period where, when we consider this, I'm looking at it as compared to what occurs with earthquakes and why earthquakes occur. That quite often earthquakes, as you may know, are due to tectonic shifts under the Earth's surface that may take a very long time to actually cause any sort of eruption. But when these eruptions do occur, they are often unpredictable and they are violent. And the ultimate landscape as a result of these eruptions can be very different from what it was before. And I raise this question particularly when we're looking at countries that have never had any experience with democracy, for the most part. Egypt had some under the British occupation, but for the most part, we're looking at countries that in the past, until very recently, never really had any democratic government at all, any experience with parliamentary life. So when we look at the instant analysis, we're analyzing, will this be successful or not? And my question is, why should we expect it to be? What anticipation should we have based on the experiences of these people, or the lack thereof, in terms of democracy? And when we look at these developments, we're looking at some countries where we can look at developments from 60 years or more. But in other cases, when we're looking at these areas, we're looking at countries whose boundaries are drawn by imperial powers, Great Britain and France, at the end of World War I, in which the individual populations had no voice whatsoever in what happened. All of these states here, Jordan, now Israel, but it was Palestine after World War I, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, etc., the maps were drawn by Britain and France for their own purposes. This was also true in Africa. Saudi Arabia did not really exist officially as a country until the early 1930s, although the Saudi dynasty controlled things before then. These little countries here are, in one way or another, the product of relations with British imperialism going back to the 19th century. So I'm going to take this broad brush approach and make some specific comparisons, and then hopefully these will lead to some questions of a more specific nature later on. Now, when I first chose this title, A Wild Roller Coaster Ride, I was thinking of it in terms of turmoil and we can't predict what's going to happen. But when I suddenly started thinking about what happens when we actually take a roller coaster ride, as I have, and presumably some of you, if not many of you have, and the more modern versions turn you all the way upside down and all this sort of thing, not when I was young, which we won't discuss. But when you take a roller coaster ride, and after all this, where do you wind up? You wind up right back where you started. And you get off and somebody else. Is this where these roller coaster rides are going to wind up? Right back where they started, where when you had dictatorial governments and sudden changes, then after a brief period of turmoil, you wind up having the same thing again. The late, he was born in Alexandria, Egypt, Charles Assawi, an economic historian, but he was known not only for his publications, but for what were called his pithy remarks. And he once compared revolutions to being more like a high jump in a track meet than a long jump. In other words, when you run down into the high jump, you'll actually land about 3 feet from where you took off. If you do a long jump, it's a much longer area that you cover and much more space, and things could be quite different. Now, this is amusing in itself, but it's not really accurate, because when we look at revolutions elsewhere, we can say, for example, with the French Revolution, that its immediate result was a high jump. You wind up with another form of dictatorship. And then you had incredible amount of turmoil that went on for almost 100 years before you finally had something resembling a democracy. What if we consider some other European countries and democracy? Italy, created in 1861. Has it ever been a functioning democracy? And that leaves out the fascist interlude, which lasted for quite some time. But even when they were supposedly democracies, how efficient, shall we were. Germany, created in 1871. European countries have not existed for all eternity, you know. When did it become a functioning democracy? Not really until after World War II, you could argue. Spain has long existed, but it has only been a constitutional democracy on a continuous basis for the last 35 years, since 1978. There are more chairs over here. And the Spanish experience, while the players may be different, suggests some things that we may look ahead to in terms of interventions, violence, etc., in the future in some regions of the Middle East and North Africa. In the 1930s, we have a radical government that was elected with very anti-religious, not likely to see soon in the Middle East and North Africa. It challenged the religious establishment, the Catholic establishment, and this led to a violent conservative counterattack and civil war that led to a dictatorship that lasted until the 1970s and the restoration of the power of the church along with it. The troops that enabled General Franco to achieve his goals were mostly foreign, Moroccans, who fought Spaniards who were defending the Republic. This is the nature of things. Outside intervention, someone else's troops perhaps. When we talk about this today, we can talk about non-state actors. Al-Qaeda people, jihadists. The borders now are very fluid because of our intervention in Iraq. Iraq doesn't control its borders, neither does Syria. People are moving all over the place. As a matter of fact, in Syria, we have competing flags of resistance groups, including the black flag, which is a Mahdist flag, essentially. That goes back to early Islam. This is Al-Qaeda. Whom are we going to support? How do we know the funds are going to get to the people we want to support? This is a very tricky business. John Kerry seems to think it's going to be easier and will be more decisive than we were in the past. When we look at all this then, and we look at Spanish history and dictatorships, brutality, would we consider this to be unique or specifically Middle Eastern if this occurred in a Middle East, North African country? But these things have happened elsewhere. Look at Russia. So the Soviet Union collapses, 1991. This has been a dictatorship for hundreds of years, whether you call it a czarist regime or a communist regime. Then you suddenly have a democratic interlude. What does that lead to? It leads to perhaps free elections, but they could have been rigged. It leads to the establishment of parliament, but it also leads to incredible corruption, exploitation by outside as well as inside forces, mafia-like groups paying parliamentarians. This has happened in this country at times. And where are we now, say 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union? Under Medvedev, well, it looked like we were actually approaching something different. We now have Putin back in power. And as a former KGB operator, he seeks to control things. And he's putting people who control the great oil companies, if he didn't like them, they're in prison. That's the way it is. So the change in Russia, we could say, is Issawi's high jump. We moved a few feet, and then we wound up where we were before. Now, in the long term, I think this will change, in part because of media and reports and other things like this, and some other unforeseen developments. I don't think Russia will continue for this if we look ahead 30 or 40 years. But for the time being, we should not be surprised that Russia has wound up being back, more or less, it would seem, where it was before. The major change being it has developed its oil reserves to the extent where it is now a major exporter of oil to Europe and one of the major oil powers in the world. Now, I'm just stressing these to suggest that what Maine may be about to experience is not all that unique at all, historically. It's just that the Western media, reporting instantaneously, gives the impression that this is an Eastern or Arab or Middle Eastern Islamic tendency that would be unknown in recent history elsewhere. Well, if recent history includes the last 100 years, then I would disagree. And the head of the Spanish province of Catalonia, which he says is wealthier than the whole rest of Spain put together, has just demanded a vote to secede from Spain. So stick close to your news and we'll see what happens there. When we look at this then, and we look at what the United States itself has contributed, we can say it's contributed quite a bit. During the Cold War, and this of course defines much of what went on in the non-Western world, the United States essentially never encountered a democratically elected government in the non-Western world or Central or Latin America that it did not try to overthrow. The only exception was really India, because that would have been too much of a challenge. But if we look at what these elected governments were and more popular rights, which they call socialism and we interpret as communism, then these governments could not be tolerated. And so we, in a sense, ourselves or through other people, overthrew these governments. Let's consider Greece, the origins of democracy, to the conservative crowd in this country, Athens. Has it ever been a stable democracy? When the Greeks elected a socialist prime minister in the late 60s, whose name was Papandreou, and whom we should have known, he was a UC Berkeley graduate, PhD in economics, he was a socialist, the Nixon administration arranged and approved a military coup that overthrew him. We have had a relatively unstable democracy in Greece ever since. Now, how to explain this, and how to explain the problems if we do intervene in the non-Western world and the Middle East? And here I'd like to quote something from Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, one of the most misrepresented books that has been published in the last half century and exploited particularly by Islamophobes after 9/11. What he says here explains not too much about what we're doing now or the Europeans, because we really are very hesitant now in terms of intervening. We're very concerned. Our Iraq experience has chastened us quite a bit, shall we say, in terms of the disasters that happened and the instability, and has led us to decide we should not intervene directly too much in the future. But what about the attitudes of people in the region? And this can apply even to the use of drones and things of this sort. Huntington says on page 51, this book came out in 1993, the West conquered the world, won the world, not by the superiority of its ideas, values, or religion, but rather by its superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do. Let me give you an example of this. In 1953, an Anglo-American coup overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran. 10 years later, in 1963, a brand new Foreign Service officer was sent to his first posting, which was in Iran, in a large city outside of Tehran. And as he later recalled, he made friends and got to know people. And finally, a friend asked him one day, why did you people overthrow Mossadegh? What was going on? And as he recalled, he had to admit, he said he didn't know what he was talking about. Because when he was briefed by the State Department, 10 years later, after the coup, on going to Iran, it was never mentioned. Westerners tend to forget, non-Westerners never do. This is 10 years. American power meant this really didn't matter. Well, it certainly did to the Iranians. And he felt humiliated by this, as he recalled it later on. Now, another major shift that is going on is that we, under the Obama administration, of course this began with the Bush administration, and democracy would be very easy to achieve, but we are supportive of democratic developments and their process of being gained, recognizing that certain difficulties may occur along the way. Now, at the same time, as you know, there's been a long-standing push by Israel, particularly its conservative wing, and people in this country and lobbies in the Beltway, to have the United States support Israel in an attack on Iran because of its nuclear development program. Well, as we look at the democratic changes that are going on now in Egypt and Tunisia, and the turmoil that is going on in Syria, who are the major funders of the very conservative Islamic groups, and including Salafists in these countries? Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been mentioned more frequently than anyone else. Which Arab countries have allied with us most vocally vis-a-vis Iran, supporting the idea of an attack on Iran? Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And yet they're the ones who are trying to undermine our policies with respect to encouraging or tolerating historical developments in these countries that are attempting, at least, a democratic experiment. Now, at the same time, these countries, which include Bahrain, are so frightened of popular movements and dissent and greater popular representation that they have brutally crushed any attempts at demonstrations. In Bahrain, for example, where at least 60, if not 70% of the population is Shiite, ruled by a Sunni minority dynasty since the 18th century, when unarmed protesters were wounded in demonstrations and went to the hospital, the police went in and arrested the doctors who were treating the patients. They didn't just arrest the patients, they arrested the doctors and threw them in jail as well. It has now turned out, only in the last week I've read about this on a website I'm on, that journalists or academics who have analyzed the Gulf for years but have written somewhat critically about developments and the suppression of dissent are now being denied entry into these countries. They're not told originally, they're told when they arrive. Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE. All this is very interesting. I'm particularly interested by Qatar because we get a European TV channel, and on their sports, they show a lot of bicycle races, you know, the Lance Armstrong type. And there have been a lot of these tour bicycle races held recently in the Gulf, one in Doha and one in Oman. So here we have the Tour de Doha and all these European bicyclists racing along and this sort of thing. And the Qatari Emeritus are buying British football clubs in the Premier League and showing how Western they are. But if you open your mouth in Qatar, it will be shut very quickly. And so Al Jazeera, which may report more accurately than some of what goes on elsewhere in the Middle East, is very quiet about what is going on in the Gulf, politically there. So we have to keep these things in mind, that our major allies and our major oil ally, Saudi Arabia, up until now, are horrified by the developments that are going on in Egypt and Tunisia particularly, and are trying very much to influence what occurs in Syria, which is one of those countries where the possibility of it remaining as a country as it is at the time is really in question, more so than in some other countries that we can discuss. Now, there are some real questions that arise here. One is, will some of these countries, such as Syria, whose maps were drawn, and Iraq as well, by the British and French after World War I, will these remain as they are 20 years from now, or even less? What issues other than domestic political matters may contribute to these issues? And here I'd like to discuss some things, again with a broad brush. One is oil. And the areas that I'm going to discuss include, of course, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Iran to a degree. But I'm going to also include countries you may not think of: Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And Turkey, along with Iraq and these countries here. Why am I going to refer to these? Because there's a beginning, and it's only now beginning, to have a major shift in oil production and discovery that will have major ramifications for the next half century. And will affect not only these countries, but may well affect Russia as well. Because Russia, as some of you may know, has been exporting through Ukraine up here, through pipelines, oil and natural gas to Europe. And the Ukraine, another supposedly democratic country, has been undermined by Russia. Its woman prime minister was thrown in jail by the next prime minister, in part because she tried to raise the transit dues that the Russians would pay to send their oil to Europe. So democracy didn't last there very long, although supposedly we have an elected parliament. Now, not only is Russia a major player at the time, although it's going to be threatened, but the United States is now becoming a major producer of oil once more. And in the next 20 years, we may become self-reliant on oil, not so much for export. An assumption is that we really don't need all that stuff from Canada, that shale oil that's very dirty, and the pipelines and the fracking and all this sort of thing. We can develop our own oil. The Canadians are very upset about this and are threatening to sell it to China, who have a very good deal going with Iran. With all the sanctions, the Chinese are now trading their cheap industrial products to Iranians for oil, which means that Iranian products, Iranians can't buy their own products that they used to manufacture, which were superior to the Chinese. But this is how you survive in a certain world where sanctions are applied. But we are now going to develop more, and we were a major oil producer for a long time. During World War I, Great Britain relied mostly on oil from the United States during World War I. That was a major reason why it took over the concession in Iran and wanted Iraq after World War I, so it could control its own resources of oil and in any future crisis not have to rely on any great power, even if that was supposedly friendly. Whenever you bought Pennzoil, if you have, its original name, it was drilled in Pennsylvania. That's where most of the oil drilling and production was at the end of the 19th century. Now, these other developments, and what I'm going to talk about now, are going to mean much less reliance on this region for oil, at least for the West. Let's take Iraq and Kurdistan up here. Boundaries technically undefined. ExxonMobil has signed oil contracts with both the government of Iraq and with the Kurdish regional government in the north. And to my knowledge, the Iraqi government in Baghdad has not made any official protest. There may have been some behind the doors agreements and all this, but there really hasn't been any much of a progress at all. On the other hand, the Turks tried to do the same thing with the Kurdish region and stepped back very quickly when Baghdad announced its fury. Now, what is going to happen here? Turkey, and there are very rich oil deposits up here, and there's still disputed areas in the Kirkuk region as to what should be Iraqi and what should be Kurdish. But you have oil pipelines that go through Turkey, and the Kurds can export this way, and these pipelines were originally built by Saddam to send oil out when the Iranians put a blockade on the Shatt al-Arab in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War. So the Turks are now profiting from this development vis-a-vis the Kurds in northern Iraq and are very eager, it seems, to want to reach some sort of agreement. If you read about those 3 Kurds who were assassinated in a Paris hotel recently, they weren't probably assassinated by Turks. They may have been trying to reach a deal for the Kurds in Turkey with the Turkish government and were assassinated by Kurds who were very much opposed to that. There's quite a bit of intrigue that is possible here. Now, some European countries, including Germany, and probably others as well, Italy will keep getting, if it can, and Libya, whatever happens to Libya, we'll have to see, but the Italians have always relied on Libyan oil, which is very cheap and immediate. But Angela Merkel has already visited Ankara, apparently to discuss oil, among other issues. And it's very much in the interests of the European Union, if it can do so, to start taking oil from here rather than relying on the Russians and the pipeline that they can feel they can shut down to push issues politically with Western Europe. So this may not happen right away, but it definitely is going to happen sometime within the next 20 years. And this idea that you have Turkish and Kurdish cooperation up here is not totally new. It's realpolitik. And we might keep in mind that after World War I, when Mustafa Kemal took over the leadership of Turkey, Turkey did not agree that northern Iraq, the Kurdish region, could be part of British Iraq until 1925. The Turks still thought it was part of Turkey. And that itself had to do with oil. Now, one of the ironies here in terms of the Kurdish and Iraqi government problems with each other is that we had 2 American political scientists. We all know about political scientists. And they went out, Noah Feldman, who's now at Harvard, was at NYU, advised Baghdad on its federal constitution. a person named O'Leary, Brendan O'Leary from the University of Pennsylvania, went and advised the Kurds on their constitution to make it read in a sense where they would be independent from the federal constitution. And both these Americans apparently acted independent of Washington. And it also happens that O'Leary's wife is a lobbyist for a Kurdish group in Washington, D.C. This is the way policies are made. Now, let's look at another area, the Golan Heights. In Syria, occupied by Israel since '67. Israel has just announced that it has awarded an oil drilling company drilling rights in the Golan Heights. This is a company based in Texas called Houston Noble Energy Company. My only comment on this is just about to develop, is that although Syria remains a candidate for collapse, if there was anything that would unite Syrians in any cause, it would be if Israel pursued oil developments in the Golan Heights. The same can be said for an Israeli attack on Iran. Whatever the differences within the regime and the opposition of so many people to the regime and the splits that are going on within the Islamist government itself, which are quite public now, if Israel attacked Iran, you would have a nationalist unity as Iranians in response. Let's look at the Eastern Mediterranean, which, according to people I'm in contact with online and who are former oil energy executives, within the next 30 to 40 years will replace the Persian Gulf as the main oil center, particularly for Europe, along with what's going on here. What is going on here? A huge, the Israelis call it Leviathan, oil and natural gas field has been discovered off the north coast of Israel. Its reserves are considered potentially to be far higher than anything that remains in this region. Now, one of the problems is that this oil field, which the Israelis call Leviathan, which is somewhat appropriate, because of its size, is off the north coast of Israel. But it extends up along the Lebanese border. The Israelis claim total control of all resources from this oil field, regardless of whose shore it is on. The Lebanese oppose this. And an American State Department official apparently informed Lebanon in 2010 that according to water rights offshore, 12 miles or 200 miles, it means you go directly offshore. You don't go north directly off somebody else's shoreline. And so Lebanon, again, although people talk about Hezbollah and opposition to Hezbollah, if this were going to happen, that Israel claimed full rights to these oil fields and natural gas, you would have total Lebanese unity against what is going to happen. Now, this is just beginning. This is not going to develop right away. But these, apparently, we think that as you go up, it extends also around Cyprus and along the Turkish southern border to some extent. This is an absolutely huge field. Various drilling rights. You could have dueling oil companies and dueling rigs in various areas, which means that Turkey could be a major player not only as a transmitter of oil from other sources, but also in terms of developing its own oil. This is clearly a major development that is just beginning, the implications of which are just beginning to be recognized. And Western Europe would, if the political ramifications of this can be worked out, prefer, obviously, to get this oil, presumably a natural gas, than they would from over here, and presumably from Russia. This also has major implications long-term for the stability of these monarchies that are so terrified of an Arab Spring and the demand for popular rights. The oil reserves, Bahrain is predicted to be the first country whose oil reserves will disappear. This could happen within 20 years. At that point, it would have no economic basis for survival unless it was supported by Saudi Arabia, which sent troops in to help suppress the demonstrations that happened recently. Now, but this has major implications for many of these tiny sheikdoms here because they have retained the support of many people by handing out benefits from their largesse from oil revenues. And the problem is, will they be able to do this? And who will do the work? I think it's Qatar, and this estimate seems to be general for these small groups, is that their populations are really, their citizens are only 2 to 5% of the whole population. So you have these giant skyscrapers that have arisen, built by foreigners. All the services are supplied by various foreigners who get differing wage scales depending on whether Yemenis or South Koreans or Bangladeshis or whoever. And all of this is something that they might not be able to afford. This won't happen in the next decade, but this is one of those things to be looking for historically as we go down the road. Now, here I'd like to look at briefly, since, and this is a dangerous topic, my wife informed me, women and Islam. She's the expert on women and gender, and she said, you know, I would never talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I don't see why you're going to talk about women and Islam. So I said, well, you know, I'm glad you're not coming. So, here I'd like to look at, in a very broad brush, the experiences of Turkey, Tunisia, and Egypt. And what comparisons will we make, and then what can we expect for Egypt and Tunisia if the Turkish experience has any relevance whatsoever? How long did it take for Turkey to become what it seems to be today? A relatively stable parliamentary democracy that is governed by an Islamist party. 80 years. From the end of the Ottoman Empire and then Mustafa Kemal taking over. So you have the end of empire, you can say just like the end of the Russian Empire, and then you got the Soviets, but the dictatorship lasts down to the 1990s. Now, keep in mind also that Mustafa Kemal benefited from major reforms and developments in the late Ottoman period, including World War I, when women in the major cities worked in plants alongside men. And as Halida Adib pointed out in 1928, they earned equal pay with men. She wrote this in the Yale Review in 1928. She went into exile. Not only did Islamists hate Mustafa Kemal, real liberal secular people had to go into exile. He would have thrown them in jail because he was a dictator. And his secularization process was ordered from the top. Now, Bernard Lewis, a long-time ally of Likud expansionist ambitions in the West Bank and encouragement of Islamophobia, wrote a book that came out in 1961 called The Emergence of Modern Turkey, which was a study of Turkey under Ataturk, and then a study including the 50s, because in 1950 you had the first free election in Turkey since 1908, under the Ottomans, when you had elections as well. Now, what happened in 1950? Turkey reluctantly held these elections because they become part of NATO as part of the Cold War alliance, and since they were an ally of the United States, we were encouraging democracy to make them look more like us. So people who had been allies of Mustafa Kemal going back to the World War I of the 1920s, total secularists, formed a party called the Democratic Party, And they won an overwhelming victory in the elections of 1950. How did they do this? By appealing to Islam, which Ataturk had been trying to crush and remove from any public space since 1922 and 1923. How could this happen? Because the secularization from the top down never really went beyond the major urban centers. Studies of Turkey in the mid-50s, when it was seen as a takeoff country example for the rest of the Middle East, just as Paul Wolfowitz used it as the ideal democratic experiment that would happen in Iraq. Turkey always gets mentioned here by various people. You had major accomplishments. You had a personal status law. Women were given the right to vote in 1930. Miss Turkey participated in the Miss Europe contest during the 1930s. You had great advances in education. There's no question about this. But roads outside the major cities became dirt tracks 40 or 50 miles outside the major cities. The main areas down here and out here were isolated from Ataturk's reforms. So the leaders of the Democratic Party, who were secularists, appealed to Islam. And that's how they won. Because obviously these people were Muslim. They'd always been Muslim. Why do we expect people in democracies in this region not to vote for Islamist parties? And as a result of these elections, the call to prayer in Arabic was allowed again, and people in all the villages out here began pulling off their broad-brimmed hats that Ataturk said were the mark of civilization and putting on the fezzes that they worn down through World War I. Now, civilization continued. Now, as I say, should we be surprised that this happened? No, we shouldn't. Do we really expect secular parties in this part of the world to succeed if they don't participate in what we call the democratic experiment? In Tunisia, to our amazement, when you had these elections, and not the one, you had supposedly over 100 secular parties, meaning everyone who thought himself a leader founded his own party. Naturally, they all canceled each other out. The same thing happened in Egypt. You have all these popular people and leaders, El Baradei, Amr Musa, the former foreign minister, and you actually do have some parties that existed from the past, the Wafd, and then you have Kafaya and Watan, but they all opposed each other. They had no party discipline. The only parties in this part of the world who have discipline and will run one candidate in a district are Islamist parties. They're the only ones that fit the Western model of democracy. Our Western secular types who studied in the States think that they deserve to rule, and so they oppose each other, but promise benefits perhaps, but they're not party people. The classic example of this was the Palestinian elections of January of 2006, in which Hamas participated with the Bush administration encouragement until they won. Then, of course, he disowned the elections and said he was horrified. But why did Hamas win when Fatah candidates got more votes? Because Fatah candidates, with their splits, ran rival candidates against each other in the same districts. Whereas Hamas, being a disciplined political party, ran one candidate in each district. So in most districts, the Fatah candidates won more votes than the one Hamas candidate, but that's not the way it works. And so Hamas won the elections. Discipline, party discipline. This leads to a second consideration with respect to what may happen in Egypt and in Tunisia looking long term. It's that when we look at this, the Muslim Brotherhood had been outlawed and many of its people tortured and killed under Nasser. But Sadat resurrected the Muslim Brotherhood. he legitimized it. He didn't legalize it, but he legitimized the Brotherhood because he could use it against the secularists and the socialists who had supported Nasser. So they were allowed to have their own newspaper, their own behind-the-scenes paper. They were allowed to function so long as they did not run candidates and they did not oppose the government. Now, you did have spin-offs of the Sayyid Qutb type and those who followed him, who assassinated ministers, assassinated Sadat, and those that were thrown out of Egypt. Most went to Afghanistan, where they, with our support and backing and Saudi money, helped fight the Russians. But the point is that the Muslim Brotherhood remained a relatively stable political organization with leaderships and committees in Egypt from 1970 to the present. Therefore, when it was ready to run for elections here, and it has done so, it has actually performed in a relatively disciplined manner. And although Gulf countries are supporting Salafists, they seem to have relatively little influence compared to what we see in Tunisia. And while there are very few Salafists in Tunisia, we've seen them on this European channel. They're very confident, long white robes, the big beards, sandals, microphones. Come and visit us. You know where we are. This is Tunisia, land of European tourists on the Mediterranean. How could this be going on? Well, one reason is that, like Egypt, you had a dictatorship in Tunisia after the French left in '56, but it was benign and it was totally secular under Habib Bourguiba, and you had personal status laws about women, which you don't have in Egypt. Now, then you had Bourguiba overthrown by Ben Ali and the Interior Ministry essentially taking over the country. And since 9/11, and even before that, we were horrified about Islamist parties. We supported a crackdown on the Islamist party that had emerged called the Ennahda Party, the Renaissance Party. And in order to survive, its leadership, including Rashid Ghanouchi, went off to London, where they were for nearly 30 years. So the Ennahda Party here in Tunisia never really existed as a functioning organization. It was under intense pressure and surveillance and torture, imprisoned with our support during this time. So in Tunisia, when you have the overthrow of the Ben Ali regime, the leadership of the party has to come back from outside, where they've had relatively little contacts and connections with organizations within the country. And so the country that you would consider the most secularized in terms of visits, universities, and things like this, is the one that has been paralyzed by political dissent, and you've had a political assassination, which would seem to be unheard of. And the University of Tunis at Manouba, where many PhDs from French universities teach, and we know, Tunisians, it was shut down for 6 months because 5 women wearing niqabs entered the building and wouldn't leave. And the rector refused to use violence to call the police to remove them. So nothing happened. You had no institutions that could act. Another difference is that you have a major military and army establishment here that has long been in existence and run the country and benefited from its rulers. If you've ever been to Cairo and ridden in from the airport, you pass by all these apartment buildings in Heliopolis, where all the officers, higher ranking certainly, live duty-free. They get all the things without customs duties as part of their loyalty to the regime. And the police were built up by Mubarak as an alternative to the Interior Ministry, although they may have fused. But the military, as the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, control many industries and much of the economy themselves. They're not about to give it up. So they may make a deal with the Muslim Brothers here. It's going to be a cautious one. We'll have to see what happens. But in Tunisia, the army has always been mostly irrelevant. It's a very small group. It was never involved in politics. There is no military force in Tunisia that can intervene, as opposed to the Interior Ministry forces, whose sympathies we don't know. And the problem in Tunisia is that you have the situation where the government is paralyzed, you have very effective people and smart people who could run ministries, but nobody is willing to make decisions. So how long will this take to figure things out? Well, if we go back to Turkey, Bernard Lewis's book was published in '61. That's the year the first democratic experiment ended, because the military intervened because of the Democratic Party's overtures to Islam and the threat they might win again. This was a threat to Ataturk's values. So the prime minister was hung along with an associate, and you reframe the Constitution. And from that time on, although you had military coups from time to time that intervened, a particularly brutal one in 1980, you still had supposedly parliamentary governments and democratic elections, but always with the threat that if you did not adhere to what the military wanted, you would be overthrown. And it took from 1961 until 2002 to get the military to concede that an Islamist party could win and run the country. Now, will the military in Egypt adhere to something over the next 50 years that we have seen in Turkey? Will it take that long, and will they play a certain game and go along, or will they overthrow the government? If one of the countries, Turkey or Egypt or Tunisia, is more likely to follow the Turkish pattern, it will be Egypt, because of the institutionalized power of the military. Tunisia, I would suggest, is more or less up for grabs. There is another point here to make, and then I'll end so that we can have questions. I don't want to keep you too long. It is Friday, after all. But I want to suggest another reason why we should not be surprised. 20 years ago, in the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World, I wrote a 10-page double-column entry on secularism, which dealt with the Islamic world. What it really dealt with was how Islamic groups reacted to foreign secular ideas that were imposed upon them. But what I discovered is that the scholarship on secularism dealing with Europe and the United States pointed in one direction. That as secularism developed in terms of secular laws overriding religious laws, in terms of secular government and things like this, as this spread, and it began much earlier in England than anywhere else. It really only began in France with the French Revolution, and you had fights about this all through the 19th century. But as this happened, you also had a marked increase in popular religiosity. They went hand in hand. The growth of secularism in government levels and all this sort of thing did not mean a decline in religiosity. It did mean quite often, and this was shown by scholarship on Europe and the States, that you did have spin-offs from the major religious groups who were seen as having acceded to this loss of influence. And so you had spin-offs in terms of other groups, small groups that developed, to represent their communities in a religious way. And this went on throughout in England and throughout Europe, and it is still going on in some ways, and it is going on in this country. Now, when we look at this then, why should we be surprised if we see the same thing occurring and lasting in the Islamic world? When Hassan al-Banna formed the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, it was not only an anti-colonialist body. He was attacking occupation. He was also attacking the secular values they brought in, particularly the problem of women adopting Western clothing, all this sort of thing. But he also attacked Al-Azhar, which was the major official religious university of the entire Sunni Muslim world. When I was there in the 60s, students from Indonesia were still going to Al-Azhar. Hassan al-Banna attacked that because they were ineffective in responding to secularism. This is a popular religious movement. You also had this in the States, and you still have it today. Let me give you an example, since we'd be so horrified as people say that if you have an Islamist government in Egypt, they'll reimpose the Sharia. Well, who's to blame for that? And is that only occurring in Egypt? Let us take the state of Alabama. We have just had a person elected for the second time as the chief judge of the Alabama Supreme Court. His name is Roy Moore. Big entry on him in Wikipedia. When he was first elected the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court in the 90s, he was removed by a federal court. Why? Because he said that divine law, in the terms of the Christian Bible and the Ten Commandments, were superior to any secular law. And in his courtroom, at his desk, he had the Ten Commandments on a tablet, and he openly declared that if it became a question between secular law and the Ten Commandments, he would rule according to religious law. He was therefore removed by other judges or the courts, and he's now been reelected in 2012. So we might keep this in mind when we look at what's going to happen here. If it took this long for Turkey to get to where it is, how long do we think it'll take before Egypt might get there? Well, this is the problem. We have no idea, and part of it, I would suggest, has to do with those westernized liberals and secularists I mentioned before. They can't get their act together. Now, maybe they would not have been a majority on the Constitutionalist Committee that wrote the Constitution, but they boycotted it. Now they're threatening to boycott the elections. Mohamed Morsi, has said that any laws that are imposed will be voted in by the new parliament. Well, guess what will happen if your secular parties and all your groups say they're so horrified that they won't even run for election. They won't participate in the democratic experience. And they say this is a matter of principle. To me, it seems stupid. How are they going to complain about something they won't participate in? And what do we know is going to happen? We don't. Mohamed Morsi has a PhD in engineering from the University of Southern California. He taught as an adjunct professor at Cal State Northridge for 2 years. Many of the Muslim brothers have been outside. It's not like they're Salafists who just wandered in and are threatening Wahhabi Islam. You see what I mean? They're relatively sophisticated, and they'd be willing to play the game with our friends, the secularists, all the people whom the Western newsmen and women interview when they go even to Iran. You know, they don't go out in the country. Well, nobody's going to be willing to translate for them. So they talk to the people who are most like them. And this is what they get. But if we're going to look at this in terms of what we can expect down the road, it may take 40 or 50 years in Egypt. It's unpredictable here. And with all these oil developments, the destabilization or reconfiguration of this region is quite likely to take a very long time. And what we see today is not what we will see in the future. My final point has to do with something that was on the PBS NewsHour last night on Turkey. And it dealt with women. In Turkey, Turkey did not truly become modern until you had its first election and you began to have economic development that affected the whole country and drew in all these regions into the national arena. And so you have universities down here and you have people migrating into the major cities. And as you've had Islamist elections and women wearing headscarves participating in the elections, so also, and this showed last night in Istanbul, the organization against violence for women include women wearing headscarves who have just arrived from the countryside, and their husbands support them. This is necessary, and they want to be employed. They do not want to be harassed, humiliated. I support my wife. So, is the fact this woman wears a headscarf mean she is not modern in the true sense of modernity? No, it is possible to be modern and to have an Islamist party ruling a country. And this does not mean the collapse of values or what we call the democratic rules of engagement. The problem for much of this region, and this whole area may be totally destabilized because of the oil issue, is that what we're going to see here is greatly more difficult, mainly because of a lack of economic resources. But the upheavals here also began in Tunisia because the Tunisian economy did not include the people from the center. They only included the people from the coastline who were connected to Europe. The same thing here. When Morsi was supporting Hamas against the Israeli attack a few months ago, you had an accident down here around Aswan in which 50 children were killed when a train hit a school bus. And they interviewed someone who said, what the blankety blank is Morsi doing dealing with Hamas? Why isn't he improving our situation down here? If we really have democracy, people can turn against the people they initially voted for. As for Israel, I will end with something here that I had predicted in a Huffington Post that disappeared rather quickly last summer. But I'm quoting military and security analysts from the past and the present, that if Israel pursues its settlement project, its chances of existing at the end of the next half century are almost minimum. In the words of Yosefet Harkabi, who died in 1993, was a former head of military intelligence and later a professor at the Hebrew University, and one of the original men at Rhodes, 28 years old. He was at the Rhodes Conference on the armistice deals with the Arab countries. Pursuing this agenda, he wrote in 1988, the revisionist agenda of the West Bank will lead to Israel's national suicide, because the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. And recently, major intelligence chiefs, retired, and security personnel have come out in Israel and talked about Netanyahu in the same way with respect to Iran and implicitly with respect to the settlements. And they refer to Netanyahu as having messianic tendencies, their term. Messianic tendencies is what Harkabi referred to when he referred to the Zealots' revolt in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Christian era, where you had autonomy under Rome, but you went for everything, for full independence, and you got it temporarily. And then what happened? You lost everything. And that is what these people are saying today. When you want everything of what you say is the land of Israel, you may succeed in the short run, but in the long run, you may lose everything. And that too could have major effects on the way we in the United States begin to look at this region again. Thank you very much for your attention.